and possibly the legal profession as well, which do, of course, very, very well out of the very, very rich people who liberalisation of the city has brought to the capital. Nick challenges the notion that resources are a boom, and he, from his own experience working in oil-rich Angola, although I think he would say oil-unfortunate Angola, perhaps, he tracks from those early days when he was journalist there how mineral wealth can make you poor and make your body politic unstable. Let me throw it to Nick. Nick, can you describe this in more detail, as you have in your book, with any other insights you've garnered since the book came out?
Yes, I hope you can hear me because my screen has frozen, for which I apologise. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I hope everyone else can.
Right. I'm trying to sort this, but I don't know what's happened. There's a ghostly picture of me on my screen, but I don't think you can see me talking. But I apologies for that. I'll try and fix that. So, in general, the central argument of the finance curse is, if you picture a fried egg with the yolk in the middle and the white on the outside, and the yolk is what you would call the useful parts of finance. We all need finance. We need a financial sector. We need it to, process our payments and ATM machines and lending to businesses and things like that. But a financial sector, once it grows beyond that useful core, starts to become, and there's an awful lot of kind of academic investigation of this, and I think a lot of people know this in the gut. But once you get beyond this useful core, once it grows beyond this useful core, it starts to become more predatory. It starts to engage in actions which are no longer aimed or involved in supporting the creation of wealth and prosperity and helping people, and more at what I call the extraction of wealth, taking wealth away from other sectors. And you mentioned the word financialization, and what that means is, it means the penetration of financial techniques, financial institutions, financial methods of doing things into other parts of the economy, into all other parts of the economy, to pretty much all of them, to be fair, from aerospace to tourism to shoe manufacturing to technology. Everything has become financialized to a very significant degree, and we can talk more about this financialization and what it means. But that's the essence of the finance curse. Once your financial sector starts to grow too big, it starts to deliver harms. And there's one very important thing to say about this. So I think everybody understands that the financial sector, using the tricks, they may be tax havens, they may be monopolization, they may be using limited liability laws in particular ways. I think people understand that can kind of redistribute wealth within the pie, from redistribute it upwards, in a sense, from poorer sections of society to richer sections. I don't think many people would necessarily disagree with that. But what the finance curse is saying, it goes beyond that. And it's saying, once your financial sector starts to grow too big and too much of this predatory stuff starts to dominate, it actually shrinks the pie. It makes your economy grow less well, and you actually lose, you lose economic output. You become poorer overall as a country. So not only redistributing in the wrong way, increasing inequality, but also shrinking the pie. And there is now a lot of, we can discuss in the questions later, but there's a lot of research coming out from the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, and a range of others that essentially produce the same graph. It's a kind of upturned banana, an upside down U shape. And what that graph shows is that when you start growing your financial sector from nothing, it supports growth. So the more finance grows, the more growth benefits and the more your economy benefits. But there comes a sort of optimal point at the top of this upside down U shape where you've kind of reached an optimal size for a financial sector, where the financial sector is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's supporting the rest of the economy. It's providing useful services. But then you keep growing the financial sector. And all this research is showing that as you keep growing the financial sector beyond this optimal point, it starts to harm growth. Growth starts to fall. And so this is the shrinking of the pie that I was talking about. And that's really the essence of the finance curse. And there's one more analogy. It takes people a while to kind of often to sort of get their heads around this idea, because there's a paradox at the center of it. Shrink finance for prosperity. It's people find it odd to, how can more money make you poorer? But that's kind of what's going on here. And the last analogy that I wanted, a quick analogy, is to make an analogy with tax havens, just to help sort of frame this in a different way. A tax haven. I also wrote a book about tax havens some years ago, and I'm a great critic of tax havens. But a tax haven effectively is a financial center that transmits harm outwards to other countries. The finance curse, by contrast, is a financial center again, but it transmits the harm inwards to your own country, and that's kind of that's the essence of it, really.
Mm-hmm. You could say that. Your book was prescient in the sense that you're in Germany, so you probably haven't walked through the city or Canary Wharf recently. But it seems to have come about, the collapsing of the financial sector seems to have come about all at once through COVID. I know it's perfectly possible that it will bounce back, but it doesn't look very optimistic. And the people I know who work in the city are pretty depressed about the future. Will this solve the problem? Has the city been cut down to size? I mean, notwithstanding the collateral damage, which presumably will be hideous for people who work around the city in the restaurants and so forth. But is this a good thing that's happened?
I only caught the second half of your question. I think what you're saying, because I had to refresh my browser to try and get my image working. I'm sorry, it still hasn't worked. But were you saying that COVID and Brexit will have damaged the city? Is that what you were saying?
Well, I was saying that COVID has sort of essentially shut the city and the Canary Wharf down, and it's still not reopened. I mean, that may well change, but there is likely to be, I would think, a quite substantial cut in the scale of the financial services sector as a result of COVID.
I think the problem with it's not as simple as that. Obviously, the city is, as I said, it's two things. It's a useful part, and it's a kind of predatory, problematic part. So when you have a big disruption like Brexit or like COVID, you're going to disrupt both parts, and where the balance of that is going to end up is a very difficult and complex question. I do think that what's happening. We will see this process of what I call financialization probably will advance as a result of COVID. I think that the best example, I think, is the big tech sector. Companies like Zoom have done very well out of Apple has done very well. Amazon has done, made billions and billions of profits out of the COVID crisis, and they are entrenching their monopolistic position over areas of tech and over many areas of our lives. And this monopolization is an aspect of this financialization. And I think this will push forwards these very harmful processes that we're seeing that are reflected in, the size of the City of London is one measure of that. It's obviously a very crude measure because, again, all these different processes going on in there. But I think in the past, pandemics have often resulted in more concentrated markets in things like this. And also they have disempowered a lot of people. They have put a lot of people out of work outside of the city who now will be in a more precarious position. And this is also a phenomenon that's very significantly about power. It is a phenomenon about political power and a relatively small number of people being able to not dictate policy, but have a huge influence over policy. And I think COVID is probably going to reinforce this power dynamic, which will make it harder for those trying to tackle financialization and tackle these processes that are going on, make it harder for them to succeed. So I think overall it's negative from many perspectives, obviously, but I think from this perspective it's probably a net negative as well.
Okay. I'm just wondering, Tim, is there something we can do about getting Nick back?
I was told to refresh my browser. I'm using Firefox. I'm sorry about this, everyone. I will try one more time, and then if not, I shall maybe switch to a different browser.
Everybody's holding.
Okay. Right, my camera is now showing the correct blue light, but it's still not coming through. I don't know why.
Maybe the system is making a point about the lack of diversity of having three bald guys with glasses dominating and rescreening their
Yes. Does it make sense to have a little hiatus and for me to copy and paste this link into a different browser and duck out and duck back in again?
Yes, I think it probably does.
Okay. Apologies for the disruption. I will be with you in a second.
I suppose what I would say is that assuming that Nick comes back, we're going to talk a little bit more back and forth, and then we're going to invite questions, which can you type them, put them through the message system, and I will put them to Nick. I'm sure people will have probably much more penetrating questions than I can offer at this stage. I have to confess I'm not an economist, so I learned a lot reading this book, but I perhaps lack the penetration to come back with trenchant questions. So we hope. I don't see any sign of Nick coming back.
So maybe could you just speak to your experience of reading the book, Stephen?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it's I think the book is I think the book is very successful at laying down the problem that we have, and I hadn't really thought of it like that. I'd always assumed I'd be one of those people who'd assumed that the city, though I never worked in the city, was a sort of good thing, and I mean, not for me, but it made a lot of money for the country, paid for public services, but I'm persuaded by Nick's argument that there are consequences to this which are not necessarily beneficial, and it is definitely true that I mean this goes beyond just the British government. This goes in America as well. But the lack of scrutiny and lack of regulation of British financial institutions has been an absolute disgrace. And when you think that quite a lot of people in America went to prison after the banking crisis, and no one really has gone to prison in Britain at all. I think they did try before sort of almost randomly selected bankers from Barclays, didn't they? But it really is quite extraordinary how soft. I mean, people in the financial sector have really not had their collars felt for quite grotesque, dereliction of duty. And this extends also, Nick's also good on the absolute destruction of the reputation of the big four accountancy firms, which have become essentially, management consultancies with a few chartered accountants attached to them. The regulation of that has been deplorable, and a lot of, as we see time and time again, the companies getting into trouble, airlines getting into trouble, but the actual annual scrutiny of something as humdrum as the company accounts, it seems that accountancy firms just don't really want to do that anymore. The money is in the consultancy, and so there's a grotesque conflict of interest often, that one of the big four will be auditing the listed company, while at the same time earning vast amounts of money in consultancy fees. So it's not exactly surprising that the benefit of the doubt goes to the company rather than to the shareholders who like to be out of pocket. Nick, you're back.
Nick is back.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry about that.
I was sort of tap dancing around the themes of your book, probably getting them wrong.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for filling, Stephen.
We were talking about accountancy, but I'm very interested in one of the things you talk about Luxembourg. I think is right at the nexus of this, isn't it? And to me, reading that, I mean, one always knew that Luxembourg was a shockingly regulated tax haven. But I think it begs to me a question: why was it tolerated by the European Union, particularly? For me, that's the really big question.
That is a very good question. And in the finance course, I'm pretty critical of the European Union. I'm not in the book. I don't take a position on Brexit because I think that there is too much. I think the European Union is a force for good in many areas, but it has many very, very serious problems. And Luxembourg it is a tax haven. What is a tax haven? There's no real definition out there of what a tax haven is. Lots of different ones, many technical ones. I boil the definition of a tax haven down to two words, really. The words are escape and elsewhere. So you take your money elsewhere, offshore, to escape the rules you don't like. And those rules might be tax, but they might be other things. They might be disclosure, secrecy. You might be a criminal trying to hide stuff. They might be financial regulation. This is my very broad definition. I see offshore as a sort of place where you try and attract. There's this whole sort of ocean of capital, of financial capital sloshing around the world, and you're trying to attract that capital as a tax haven, if that's your sort of national strategy. And you're trying to attract it with enticements. You're trying to attract it with low taxes or tax loopholes or financial secrecy or very lax financial regulation or very particular corporate governance rules. Delaware is a sort of tiny little tax haven inside the United States where that's one of the great attractions. Most or many of the world's biggest companies, Coca-Cola and many others, are incorporated in a rather seedy-looking business building in Orange Street in Wilmington, Delaware, and that's because they pay just a few hundred, just small fees to register there, and then they get the benefit of Delaware's courts, which are very friendly towards management, and so there's this kind of game going on with lots of different jurisdictions offering lots of different things in different niches, and so. Some niches are very specialized. So you might get the Cook Islands is a very small, tiny little niche, and it offers very, very sort of impregnable and very kind of sleazy trusts. So that would be a very specific niche. Somewhere like Luxembourg offers a lot more than that. It has offered a lot of tax facilities. So there was a great LuxLeaks scandal when there was a series of leaks, whistleblower leaks from PwC that was operating a kind of tax avoidance factory in Luxembourg for many of the world's biggest multinationals. Many Nike and lots of ExxonMobil, lots and lots of household names. And these companies were able to go to Luxembourg and say to PwC, please cook us up a tax strategy. And this would be a sort of international tax strategy that would involve several stepping stones involving Luxembourg, but other places, depending on what they were trying to do. And they would get these really complicated tax strategies, and there were often sort of complicated diagrams of where the money would flow. And they would take it to a guy called, I can't remember his name, but he was known as Monsieur Ruling. He would make a ruling and he'd basically say, yes, this is fine, and put a sort of rubber stamp on it. And then that was all legal. And so Luxembourg was doing this kind of stuff. It was also very involved in quite complicated structures, enabling people with money to hide that money, hide it from the taxman or from criminal authorities or whatever. There has been a bit of cleanup recently. But why has the European Union tolerated this? It's a very good question, and Luxembourg is one of the founder members of the original group, and it has always been very influential in the European Union. And there are lots of areas where there is kind of, you have to have unanimous voting for things to be changed. So that is a problem. If you want to change things, sometimes in certain areas you can't. If one or two, and you'll always get the same. Ireland, Luxembourg, and a few others say no, we don't accept this. And there is also another thing. The single market rules make it quite hard for you to put obstacles in the way. If you start trying to block things, you can sometimes get in the way. You fall foul of the single market rules. So there's a whole series of things that prevents the European Union from doing much about Luxembourg. Having said that, I think, London, the UK, it plays some similar games, some different games, some of the same games it plays, like on sequence stuff, it kind of farms out to the British overseas territories and crown dependencies, the Cayman Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, British Virgin Islands, places like that, in a sort of complicated, to use a slightly sinister analogy, the spider's web, where kind of capital is handled in these places, and often the real business of doing the kind of, the nuts and bolts of putting together that merger or putting together that tax strategy or whether will be handled in London. So kind of, fees and wealth flow to London. So, but yeah, Luxembourg is a very interesting. The Financial Times Alphaville had a piece, I think it was in 2017, calling Luxembourg essentially a criminal enterprise with a state attached or something like that. And I think that's not so far from the truth. I mean, it's one of these kind of, you go there and it's squeaky clean. Everyone's incredibly polite. It's very like Switzerland in that respect. And it was one of my previous book, Treasure Islands. It was often my first question when I was interviewing people in Switzerland and other places. So you say to us, the Swiss have a reputation for, like the Luxembourgs, for being honest, clean, spotless, tidy, all these really good qualities, polite, and trustworthy. And the trustworthy thing is absolutely crucial. And yet, at the same time, Switzerland has been... So because of those qualities, it's sort of ended up very high up on these, you have Transparency International Corruptions Perceptions Index, so, which are the most corrupt countries in the world, and, all the African countries rise to the top, and, Switzerland, one of the cleanest, and Luxembourg as well, and the UK too. But at the same time, Switzerland has historically, and still is to a significant degree, one of the world's biggest kind of turntables for dirty money, for money looted out of Africa, for organized crime, criminal money. There's less than there used to be in Switzerland and in Luxembourg. But still, how do you square these? There's an apparent contradiction here. There's sort of extreme trustworthiness and honesty and tidiness and against this other aspect of huge turntable for sort of dirty money, sort of global epicenter of corruption, if you will. And it became clear to me that it's a business model, which is sort of industrial policy, you might call it, for a country, where you say to the world's capital, you can trust us not to steal your money. Send your money to us, we'll handle it, we won't steal your money. But we will also turn a blind eye if you want to steal someone else's money. If you want to do something dirty that damages someone else somewhere else, that's fine. Trust us, but also trust us not to cause trouble for you. And so it's a very strange kind of formula, but it's been very effective for those people in those countries who got very rich out of it. And I think the UK plays that game to a very significant degree as well.
Yeah. Okay. We have turned to Doro asked, I'm interested in the way we are made to think of competition, in inverted commas, between countries. Threats from big companies to leave. How can this be challenged?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's a question that I come across all the time. And it's tied up with this thing they call competitiveness. We've got to be competitive. You hear it sometimes politicians say we've got to have a competitive tax system, we've got to have a competitive financial regulation. We can't tax them or regulate them too much, or they're going to run away to Hong Kong or Singapore or Geneva or Zurich or wherever. And this is a very, very effective tool, this threat. It is a threat. It's like, don't do this, don't tax us, or we're going to run away, and then you'll lose jobs. And that's and it's a threat that has been very effective. And politicians kind of not knowing what to do in the face of this threat, say, okay, we'll give you what you want. It's you could call it blackmail, I suppose. And it happens all the time. In Britain, it usually happens in very, very sophisticated ways. You'll have HSBC, whispering in the ears of FT journalists saying, we're considering our options about where we're going to locate our headquarters, and we're doing long-term reviews, and not saying anything explicit. We're not making explicit threats, but just kind of these very kind of subtle messages that are put out, and certainly within government, but also put out into the media. And what can you do in the face of these threats? Well, two things. One, historically, these threats are made all the time, and talk is cheap. And historically, time and again, when governments have called the bluff of these big companies, they say it in the oil industry as well, don't make our fiscal regime any more onerous or we'll run away. And historically, very often, countries have said, OPEC countries, for example, said, I'm sorry, we're not going to play that game anymore, and we're going to massively increase our revenues and increase your tax take after these threats have been made. And then the companies are faced with, are they going to run away? Their profits are going to be cut in half, but they're still making massive profits. Are they going to run away from half the profits that they used to have? And nearly always they don't. They, the bluff is called, and they don't run away. And it turns out that the high tax countries have, in the long term, grown roughly as fast as the low tax countries, but with less inequality in general terms. So you could argue that the high tax countries have generally been better off. And there's a whole sort of historical story to tell there. But the other side of it is that the finance curse way of looking at things is actually very liberating from this perspective, because it's saying, let's say take financial regulation, for example. Financial companies, before the global financial crisis and to a certain degree since, have made these threats. You can't regulate us too much. You mustn't put this regulation in place. We're all going to flee. And the finance curse argument says, well, this lax regulation that has caused the crisis and has also continued to cause many other problems that I outline in the book, is actually net regulation that we need to protect our own country. So if we deregulate and we allow these predatory activities to become more dominant, then we're hurting ourselves. And so if we regulate properly and effectively in the name of our country and our people and what they need, the companies certainly will threaten to leave, and maybe they will leave. They will take part of their operations away. They will still have profits to be made here. They will keep some of their operations here. And in general, it's quite a good sorting machine, because good, strong regulation will tend to keep the stuff that you want, and it will tend to chase the predatory stuff away, which is exactly what you want. So you can kind of turn away from this competitiveness meme that you hear all the time. I mean, other terms are like open for business. We must be open for business, which, it sounds great, and we should be open for business and welcoming to business. But the question is, what kind of business? And you need to have effective regulation. You need to have an effective tax system that allows you to educate your people and build roads and infrastructure and have a decent health system. That's what companies want. That's what the investors really want. That's what, if you want, the best kind of investment is probably a car factory or something. They need good roads. They need healthy and educated workforce. All of this stuff takes tax, and you need to have a strong tax system that provides these things.
Okay. Well, Nick, the question. Thanks for that. A question, which is from a robust business perspective. Andrew Davidson. He says, surely there are more macroeconomics that come into play regarding the tipping point for a country. For example, Ireland. Now, you talk about Ireland quite a lot in the book, of course, and it's recent sort of financial history, not very flatteringly. But Andrew says, for example, Ireland has done a fantastic job for their country attracting large companies, especially pharma, by offering them things such as 12% corporation tax rate. They are a tiny island that thrive by investing in business as a tax haven. I do have an opposite bias, as I have companies in Delaware, etc., and have seen a lot of benefit from this. What would you say to that?
Right, yes, Ireland. I've got a whole chapter on Ireland in the Finance Coast book, and there is a completely different story to be told. There is this. Ireland is a kind of totemic example. You know, they had this Celtic tiger, and they had this 12.5% corporate tax rate, and people have, in Ireland and beyond, have always said, look at Ireland, it cut its corporate tax rate to 12.5%, and it got this fantastic economic boom. That's not what happened. Ireland started trying to be a tax haven in 1956 with a thing called the Export Profit Relief Tax. And it introduced several other kind of attempts at being a tax haven to sort of cut tax rates or provide, loopholes or whatever for companies to come. Now, how do you measure the result of that? Well, you could measure, Ireland grew economically since 1956, but a proper measure that tells you whether this is actually making a difference is a comparison of Ireland's GNI per capita. GNI is a version of gross domestic product, GDP, which strips out profit shifting. So if you use GDP, a lot of profit shifting comes through Ireland. This is multinationals shoveling huge profits, but it hardly touches the sides, and it doesn't really get into the Irish economy, and it doesn't benefit Irish people. So GNI per capita is a better measure. It's not perfect, but it's a better measure. Gives you a sense of how well Ireland is doing, Irish people are doing. So the best measure of what's happened since 1956, since Ireland started trying to be a tax haven, is GNI per capita as a share of the European average. So compared to other European countries, how well has Ireland been doing? And if you actually go and find the data and you plot it on a graph, you get this remarkable picture. And I'm thinking, I think this is going the right way. I don't know if this isn't a mirror image. Okay, so on this graph, you start in 1956, and Ireland's GNI per capita is roughly 2/3 of the European average, something like that, maybe 60%, I can't remember. And it flatlines. It flatlines all the way till 1992, 93, and then it goes like this. It suddenly jumps into the stratosphere, and that's the Celtic tiger. And it actually, you have a boom, and then you have a crash, and then you have another boom. And now Ireland's GNI per capita is significantly higher than the European average. So this is very different from the story of the tax haven causing Ireland's growth. What actually happened was there were a series of things that came together. I mean, in the book, I describe it as the luck of the Irish. There was a series of educational reforms that suddenly produced a huge rush of well-educated graduates onto the market just around that time, and a huge surge of women into the workforce and all sorts of things like that. But the really big thing that 1992-93 suddenly created the thing was Ireland entered the single market. And here you had a country that was, for American multinationals, friendly. A lot of American bosses had, links to the old country, English speaking. And in the single market, suddenly you had access to this whole European market, this sort of seamless market where they could set up shop in Ireland and sell their services. Often they were kind of digital services, and sell it to, someone in France or Germany or wherever. And that's what really caused that takeoff. It's a very different story. Now, of course, the corporate tax incentives will have changed the shape of that thing, but did they help the Irish people overall? I argue not in the book. I argue that it made a much more boom and bust cycle. And also, by virtue of having much lower tax rates, they would have got much lower tax revenues than they would have done otherwise. You can't really be sure of how much investment. It would have been a different investment shape and different US investment coming in. But basically, that whole story about Ireland's 12.5% corporate tax rate caused the Celtic tiger is wrong. It's a myth. And if you want to read more about it, then I know a book where you can read it called The Finance.
Yes. That really shows it.
Sorry, Stephen, could I just, thank you.
Yeah.
Could I just mention, we've got we seem to have sort of two chat boxes, it seems, on this. So there's one called Chat, And then there's one underneath it. There's one called questions.
Yes, I've just got into questions now. So
thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Sorry, let me just. I had the question. Yes. Carolyn Heyman asks, did this all start with? Well, you partially answered this. This all. I think this should not talk about Ireland here. I think generally, did this all start with the Big Bang in 1986? And then, secondly, any idea how it can be unwound?
Okay. No, this didn't start with the Big Bang in 1986. So there's the historical story. In fact, through history, going back centuries, there have been conflicts between finance and other parts of the economy, manufacturing and so on. I think probably go into that a bit later because it's a bit of a distraction from the main point. But the historical story I want to tell is after the Second World War, you'd had not only the war, but you'd had the Great Depression beforehand, which was a Great Depression very much born out of finance. I mean, significantly in the United States, but it reverberated around the world. You had massive kind of financial dominance of markets, which created this enormous crash, devastating crash. And so that provided that sort of discredited finance. And then the Second World War provided the sort of political impetus to really do something. And there's Lord Carrington describes how he used to sleep under his tank in the war with his working class comrades, and like they were like the best people he'd ever known. And when we get into power, we're going to do something for these people. And I think there was, and also people who had lost family members and shed their blood in the war really didn't want to take any more kind of this domination. They really wanted something different. So there was a massive change in political will, like what is politically possible. And they created this remarkable international architecture called the Bretton Woods system, which was a way of recognizing that finance was dangerous. It was useful, but potentially dangerous, and putting finance back very carefully into its box. So from an international perspective, what they did in the Bretton Woods system from the Second World War was to very carefully regulate flows of finance across borders. You could, if you were trading, if you were selling goods across borders, you could then arrange, you could get permission. You go to the central bank and you get permission, like I need to transfer this much money overseas, and you get a stamp saying, yes, you can do this. But generally, speculation across borders, all the stuff you see these days was stopped. I mean, it was leaky, of course, and tax havens started coming in and sort of punching holes in the system. But for about a quarter of a century after the Second World War, you had this, it's called financial repression, when the financial sector was really, really crushed, and people in the city were absolutely furious. This is people in the city who really had grown rich. This dates from the British Empire, when London was the kind of the sort of the governor of the imperial engine, as they call it, the sort of central turntable in which all the imperial kind of money went through, and the city was used to being very dominant in British society, and suddenly they were crushed down, and they were absolutely furious and looking for escape routes. That period, by the way, which was also a period of very, very high taxes, in the US, top income tax rates went above 90%. In the UK, effective top income tax rates went up as high as 98%. And there was much stronger antitrust, anti-monopoly regulation. It was much harder for big companies to grow big. Lots of what you would call very progressive things. That period, that quarter century, is now called the Golden Age of Capitalism. It was the period of highest economic growth in world history, before or since. And what happened after that is you had finance started coming out of its box. And there was a thing called the Eurodollar market, which was really the precursor of the Big Bang, which was a sort of, it was very involved in tax havens, and London was the center of it. It was a kind of an escape route from this Bretton Woods system. The Bank of England said, let's allow this stuff to happen in London. It grew like a balloon and eventually began to dominate global markets, and money just started sloshing around the world. And it's sort of, by the mid-70s, that Bretton Woods system of financial repression was killed, was dead. And finance has started to go much more quickly around the world. And economic growth started to fall, inequality started to rise, and you got a lot more financial crisis since then. So, and the Big Bang was just another very important and more famous step in this process of financial liberalization that happened. And the City of London was right at the center of the liberalization of global markets. But it was kind of the second step after the Second World War, after the euro-dollar markets. And
Nick,
so now, yeah.
Nick, I want to ask you. To me, there's a peculiar, slightly baffling omission in your book, if I may say so. And I read it closely and I checked the index to make sure I haven't missed it. But you were writing this during the Labour leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, at a time when populists were going great gangbusters across the Atlantic in the early skirmishes of the presidential election. But there's not a single mention of Jeremy Corbyn. There's not a mention of John McDonnell. You're obviously politically firmly on the left, but yet you seem to be, by omission at least, resigned to the fact that formal parliamentary democracy is not going to remove the finance curse, and that you seem to be hinting in your conclusion at sort of extra parliamentary activity through the Fair Tax Alliance or whatever it's called. Is that fair? Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. It is a glaring omission. I agree with you, and I thought long and hard about whether to include Corbyn in and what to say about him, because I was quite ambivalent about Corbyn. I think I did like a lot of the things that he was saying. I mean, he recognised that and John McDonnell recognised many of the problems that I had been describing and accepted that they needed to be tackled. But there were all sorts of other things going on that were very maybe alienating or difficult, and in some senses I felt a little old-fashioned. But I was, I definitely would have voted for him. I didn't, because I've lived outside of the UK for too long and I don't have my vote anymore. But I didn't mention him in the book. I mean, I could have, but I would have got caught up in all sorts of things which I felt were a distraction, and I wanted to focus on, because once you say the word Corbyn, particularly in those times, you're pressing a button, and all sorts of assumptions and love or hate will emerge in the reader's eyes. And I think it's very important to cut through that stuff, that complicated stuff. And by the way, I mean, you said that I'm on the left. I don't disagree with that, but also I don't like that, because I think so many of these issues that I'm talking about, and I'm sure you'd agree with me having read the book, are not really issues that belong to the left or to the right. I think, this is about the corruption of markets. This is about crime. This is about corruption. This is about people being able to take rewards without taking risks. It's about things that this is not what, even if you're a staunch believer in capitalism, this is not what capitalism is supposed to be. This is rigged. There's something wrong going on here. And I think Corbyn very much recognised that. But I don't think, it's people on the left who worry about rigged markets or about corruption. I think plenty of people on the right, whatever those terms mean these days. Mm. So I don't really, this is not a book for people on the left. I get it's probably written in more kind of left-friendly language, I would say. I do get a bit hot under the collar when I'm thinking about these things sometimes, and maybe that was reflected. I think on reflection, maybe I was a little.
You call Hayek a mediocre Austrian economist.
Yeah,
that was an indication.
Yeah, Exactly.
By that token, Napoleon's a sort of mid-ranking, Corsican military strategist, I suppose. But I mean, at the moment, I can't help thinking. I felt as I finished your book, I felt the moments sort of, in a way, is no danger the moments past. We now have a Labour Party led by a man who's actually our local MP here, who's actually popular in these parts, Keir Starmer. I mean, he's not going to lead us to a New Jerusalem, a slimmed down City of London, is he?
No, I don't see that. I mean, I think it's probably early days. I think he's probably still deciding about these things, but I haven't seen any very clear signs of a real willingness to properly take on this. Because if you're taking on to take on this agenda, you are taking on the City of London, which is arguably the most powerful interest of all in the UK economy. Not in Germany where I live. That's probably cars, but. I don't see the same willingness. I think Corbyn was willing to actually confront this thing in slightly odd ways sometimes, but he saw the problem. He saw some aspects of financialization. I don't think he necessarily saw it all, but I don't see quite the same willingness with Keir Starmer. I think this government is entirely on the wrong side of this debate. Boris Johnson. I actually have. I was going to share my screen and show you something, which I think illustrates something about the finance curse. But given the technical problems, I should probably avoid it. It was a short video of Boris Johnson saying, some years ago when he was mayor of London, saying, "You will create jobs in Strathclyde more if you invest in Croydon in London than if you invest directly in Strathclyde." This image of London as the kind of engine of the British economy from which wealth and jobs and stuff, the dominant view in Britain that London is the kind of wealth creating engine. And taking a geographical perspective, in the book, I look at a lot of these structures where the extraction is happening out in the provinces, out in the regions, out in Scotland, in also poorer parts of London. And the wealth is being realised, is being funneled into a relatively small number of people. There's hundreds of thousands of them probably, including all the lawyers and accountants and so on. But a relatively small section of the population is the beneficiary, clustered mostly around London. And so, the image of all this wealth flowing outwards from London, in fact, there's all sorts of flows coming in exactly the opposite direction under the table. And the Finance Curse book argues those flows are much bigger than the visible flows you see going out. Right. So it's a net. So rebalancing, we're always talking about rebalancing the UK economy. And the big question is, can you rebalance the economy without reducing the City of London, without shrinking the City of London? And I would answer no. I think you have to. You can't just uplift the regions. You have to shrink the predatory stuff in the city if you want the regions to prosper.
Right. Here's a timely question, given recent events over the last few weeks. From Dali P. Does your reference to the British Empire not suggest that the UK has particular cultural issues with regard to finance and the associated city professions, an attitude of entitlement that undermines other parts of the country?
Okay, I think the attitude of entitlement is very important. Just a little anecdote. I know a guy called David Marchant who runs a company called Offshore Alert. They're based in Miami, and they're kind of like a tax haven. They investigate tax haven shenanigans and stuff like that. And he said when he sees in a financial structure that he's investigating, if he sees a lord or a sir or one of these British titles, he takes it as a red flag. And what that tells me is that the British establishment has become so thoroughly steeped in these processes. And my belief is that a sense of entitlement that has been instilled and inculcated in a lot of people since they were at school or whenever means that people are prepared to do anything to get to the position they feel they need to be in. And that doing anything really has corrupted the large parts of the British establishment where they are prepared to get involved in activities that, these things that are going on out in tax havens really are, a lot of them are very, very unsavory, but in order to maintain their place in society. Cultural issues with regard to finance, that is something that needs an awful lot of unpacking. There is a whole, in my previous book, I've got a title called The Second British Empire, which looks at how, again, in 1956, the Suez Crisis, when that was the kind of trigger for Britain to sort of step away from all its colonies, pull its forces out, and you had a series of countries going independent after that, and a little bit before that. But Suez was kind of the watershed, and that was also the time when the Eurodollar market I was talking about, which made sort of London regain its status as the world financial centre kind of started. And so I think you can start talking. There are other people who talk about Empire 2.0. So Britain kind of stepped away from having soldiers and governors in all of these places, or most of these places, and now it's doing it through finance. It's got financial, whatever you want to call them, tentacles, if that's not a bit sinister, in countries all over the world. A lot of money coming into the city of London. And a lot of these things, I was just looking at a deal in Ghana last week, very, very unsavoury deal that they're talking about that was rushed through Parliament with almost no scrutiny, and a lot of city players involved in that. So there is there's a whole story to be told here, and I don't think we can get into the sort of detailed cultural aspects of it, but it's a good question.
Stephen, hi. Nick, thank you. Yeah, I'm just noticing the clock has brought us all the way round to pretty much to the end of the hour, but I think maybe we've got time for one more question. Then once that's finished, I'm going to press a button that is going to take us all, everyone here, into what on AirMeet is called the lounge, and you will be able to pick yourselves a table and have a conversation with whoever else you find on that table, part of our community connection service. So you may find Nick and Stephen there as well. You may end up on a different table. But I just wanted to read actually the last lines of the book. So it speaks a little bit to what Nick was talking about in terms of politics. But the old political divisions between left and right are dead. In today's Britain, one of the greatest political divisions is between those who support financialization and the finance curse and those who want to return finance to its proper place, serving society. Which side are you on? So, thanks, guys. One more question from you, Stephen.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Okay, fine. Then.
So, thanks very much indeed, Nick.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks.
It's been very interesting talking to you.
Great to talk to you. So we'll try and head for the lounge somehow.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating.
I'm just going to post our donations link, and then we're going to take a break. So.
Will I press to get to the lounge?
How do